I'm Chris Nessie, host of Behind the Mic, Voices of the EPN, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey, welcome back. Steve here, and today I'm talking with Jeff Ikler. He's an author and a coach and so much more. You've heard him on this podcast as we've talked about different topics as if we were sitting on the park bench someplace or something like that. And today we're talking about Jeff. As I was like, wow, he's been on the show a lot, but we've never talked about him, and he's got such a cool background. So good stuff. We're talking about teaching, publishing, writing, podcasting, coaching, and of course, fishing. Cool stuff today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And then, by the way, before you go, it'd be so cool if you went to my website, stephenmiletto.com/reviews, and left a review. What do you think? Could you say a few nice words and maybe 5 stars? That'd be so cool. You are awesome. Enjoy the show.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Miletto. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. Teaching, learning, leading, K-12. With Dr. Steve Miletto.
Jeff Ikler is the director of Quetico Leadership and Career Coaching. He works with leaders in all aspects of life to identify and overcome obstacles in their desired future. He came to the field of coaching after a 35-year career in educational publishing, where he served as an editor, marketer, and eventually the head of all publishing disciplines. There he was first exposed to coaching as a client, self-awareness, and realizing that leadership is behavior in the service of those doing the work. Prior to his career in educational publishing, Jeff taught high school American history and government. Jeff currently hosts the Getting Unstuck, Cultivating Curiosity podcast, which focuses on looking at the familiar from a different angle and the new with an open mind. Jeff co-authored Shifting, How School Leaders Can Create a Culture of Change. Shifting integrates leadership development and change mechanics in a 3-part change framework to help guide school leaders and their teams toward productive change. Jeff has a new book in the works, and maybe we'll get a chance to get him to talk about it. And he also enjoys fishing. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me today. Welcome to the show, and say hi to everybody.
Hi, everybody. Steve, it's so good to be with you. It's a great way to end the week on a Friday, and it's nice to be on this side of the mic.
Very cool. Well, thanks for joining me, and thanks for being on that side of the mic so we could talk. We've done a bunch of shows together and stuff like this, and it dawned on me, I'm like, hey, we've never talked about you. And it's like, you got all this cool stuff you got going on and have done, and we need to make sure we do that. Plus, we got this cool thing in common, which is you're a history teacher, I was a history teacher, and we both like fishing too. And there's a lot of other things in between there.
There we go.
Good stuff. All right, so let's first start by talking about you as a teacher. What'd you like most about teaching?
What did I like most about teaching? I think the first thing that comes to mind, Steve, I taught in an era when there was none of this end of course high stakes testing. The only test we had to give was a simple Constitution test, just the very basics of the U.S. federal Constitution. But we didn't have this pressure on us. We had a curriculum, we had standards, but we didn't have this pressure on us to be preparing kids for this test. And I really thrived in that environment. I don't know how well I would do if I had these big tests staring me at the face. The other thing that I liked, at least when I taught, is I had a great deal of freedom as a teacher. And as I said, we did have a curriculum, which I actually helped write for U.S. history. And but the real goal of my course was helping kids to learn how to think. I had no illusions that they were going to leave and know U.S. history, front and back. But what I wanted them to do was to leave being able to think. And that's one of the things that really concerns me today about certain parts of the country where, we have book banning going on, we have curriculum restrictions going on. And I don't know, my experience, Steve, that's just not the right way to go with kids, is that We want them to be thinking adults. And anyway, so that's one of the things that I really appreciated about my time in the classroom.
That's cool. I appreciate you sharing that, because that's, it's one of the things, unless someone's actually worked with kids in the classroom, you don't really get it until you're there. And because there's nothing better than when, I've heard lots of people describe it different ways, but when that light bulb goes on and they kind of get it and they want to, no matter, they're not worried about looking dorky or something like this. They get into what you're talking about, and it's like, wow, cool. That's fun.
Yeah.
It's good stuff. And
it's having different expectations,
Right.
It's so.
No, that's cool stuff. One of the things that I appreciated most about my past in teaching as well is that even though there was other stuff happening at the times, we still had a type of freedom that we worked in the classroom, and so it allowed the interactions and the kids to figure out that they might like this stuff too, even though they might not admit it to you until like 2 years after they finish your class.
Exactly. I was fortunate, Steve. I don't know how your setup was, but I was fortunate to teach in a department. It was more of a fraternity than anything else. I mean, we just got along so well, and we taught in classrooms that had a movable divider.
Oh,
so we
cool.
could open up, and instead of working with 30 kids, we could be working with 60 kids, and which was very cool in terms of group work. We actually developed a risk game once around World War II.
Nice.
Where we used the black and white squares on the floor.
Nice.
And the kids played out World War II, which, you can talk about it, you can read about it, but until you try to operate a two-front war as Adolf Hitler, it's like, okay, now I get it,
Yeah, that is cool. That would have been a cool experience. That would have been fun, especially using all the space to help you make it come alive. So
absolutely
nice. I like that. I've had a couple of those moments in my teaching where there were the camaraderie and the way you work together and stuff like that so pays off when you're in a world like that.
Yeah.
That's cool. Good stuff. So, all right. So let's talk about this. If you had a chance to go back in time to right before that first day that you taught, and had a chance to give you advice. Now I'm going to throw a lot of yous at you here in just a second. All right. So done on purpose, but so you had a chance to go back in time to right before that first day that you taught and had a chance to give you advice. What would you tell you before you set foot in that classroom?
Oh. Well, one thing that comes to mind immediately is I would not teach it chronologically.
Ah, cool.
I don't think that serves kids well. I would teach it thematically. I would look for some big themes and really look at the chronology. I guess vertically, Steve. You look at certain events and you're tying events together that support a theme. But what I would want kids to see is that a nation has certain behaviors, and some of those behaviors can repeat over time, and they can relate to other behaviors. So that's one thing I would do, is teach thematically. The other thing I would do, and you and I have talked extensively about this, I'd want to get the kids to the point where their interest would be triggered in a certain topic that they would want to go and explore a little bit. Instead of me directing everything, there could be something that they want to explore and own. And again, I think that's something that helps generate interest on the part of kids, is that you're really saying what's of interest to you here. So that's what I would do. I would tell you one thing, Steve. I would do a ton less homework than I did especially in my early years, because I was still of the mind in the early years that, we're going to learn U.S. history,
Nice.
And I've read too many studies that says homework doesn't really add up to anything anyway. So, I might change it, but I would certainly take the pressure off of them and the pressure off of me.
That's a great point. I got to tell you, because I would be the same. I was always trying to keep up with in the beginning when when I started. There's a lot of trying to keep up with the Joneses. You look around the social studies department and go, well, what are they doing? And, as you're trying to figure out who you're going to be as that teacher. And so some of it, I'm like, I'm never doing that.
Yeah,
and then,
exactly.
And then others kind of like, oh, that's pretty cool, like that. And matter of fact, what you're talking about with the thematic versus the timeline, I actually had a colleague I think I met her like in my third or fourth year, who I'd never thought about it that way. And she introduced me to doing it that way, which was pretty cool. So, but when you're influenced by colleagues around you, I think that's one of the things that people don't realize in teaching. It's really important to choose your friends well.
Yeah, exactly. The other idea, it's a variation on the theme of teaching thematically. I had a wonderful conversation one evening with the late David McCullough.
Oh, cool.
I was trying to entice him to become an author. This is when I was with the publishing company. I was trying to entice him to become an author on the program. And he was working on another book, so he couldn't do it. But boy, did he give me some great ideas. One of which was teach U.S. history backwards.
Nice.
Start with the present, identify the themes that we see, and then work your way back and see what surfaces when, and I think it's a much more interesting way to approach it.
That it is, because that's one of those things that when you do it that way, then you definitely get to the more modern time frame because you started there.
Exactly. Which I tried to race through history to get to World War II. That was my period. World War I and World War II. That was my period. And it wasn't that I didn't think that talking about Jacksonian democracy or the Civil War was important, but I was just seeing World War II more as a watershed for the way the world is today.
Gotcha.
So I spent an inordinate amount of time on that.
Nice. Well, I remember some colleagues who didn't even get, they get that far, and then they go, all right, now I got to finish how to wrap up the rest of it, and hop, skip, and a jump, and suddenly they're in the modern era, and it's like, oh God, You can't do that, man. You got to. So
you don't get to civil rights, you don't get to the Vietnam War, you don't get to Watergate,
Right. And there's so much there, and it's and then now it's like, did you ever read the comics The Far Side?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah. He had some of the best ones talking about history, the teachers teaching U.S. history. All right, George, put your name down. You've got an A. We're good. Stuff like that. Anyway, that's awesome. All right, so let's talk about, eventually your career path goes a different direction. I mean, I've read in your bio, you had a 35-year career in educational publishing where you served as an editor, marketer, and eventually the head of all publishing disciplines. Talk about cool. All right, let's talk about that. So how'd that happen? And
well, that was actually a pretty easy transition. I moved from teaching social studies to actually working in the social studies department as the lowest form of human being in the editorial realm. Nice. It was just short of get me coffee. Let me put it that way.
Nice.
But I learned the ins and outs of school publishing, and it was very interesting to help construct a book or a program with resources and that sort of thing. And yeah, so I eventually became head of publishing, and when I first started out, Steve, I figured it out once, there were about 35 major publishing companies in the US. And when I finished my career through consolidation, realignments, and all of that, there were 3 major publishing companies still left.
Wow.
They had just absorbed all of these other companies over time. And I was absorbed twice.
Wow.
So the industry saw a great deal of change, and now it's going the other way, where we see a lot of small boutique publishers that are focusing on technology that are coming alive.
That's cool. By the way, I did not know that I was in. When I read that in your bio, I'm like, oh my gosh, man! You're talking about royalty, man. We got you're at the top of the game, and with what you're doing, you got to talk about what you like the best about what you did there. We talk about teaching. You got to talk about what you like about this, because you didn't just stay there for a couple of days.
Well, I think the best part, the most informative part, was that I got to work directly with administrators and teachers.
Nice.
You know, I went from the classroom back into the classroom, but through a different door, if you will. And I especially liked talking with teachers. And it was very interesting to see how things had changed since I had been in the classroom. So that was a real plus. Also working with some real top-notch authors, as I mentioned, David McCullough. I never got to work with him other than having that great discussion that one night about U.S. history and how he would teach it. But I got to work with the late Daniel Borston extensively.
Oh my gosh.
Who was our former head of the Library of Congress, and just a amazing writer, just what he could do with words. And so I think that was really nice, was working with authors when authors were still writing the books. They weren't done by committee. They were actually, we hired people because they had a point of view.
That's cool. That's cool. Now I know something, that if I could go back in time, I would go back in time, find you and say, one day you're going to become the head of publishing and all this sort of stuff at this big publisher, and you're going to meet these guys, and you have to go look up this guy named Steve Miletto and introduce him to Borston and to McCullough. So
I would say Dr. Steve Miletto.
You're too kind. But what a cool experience that must have been, to be able to have contact with the prolific writers, and also talk with people who, like you said, wrote the books instead of by committee.
Yeah. It was a challenge, because when you get consolidated from 35 companies down to 3, everybody's worked for another company, and because of that, everybody has the same way of thinking. And one of the most rewarding experiences I had, Stephen, this was toward the latter part of my career. I was asked by my boss if I would head up an innovation initiative, because it was very hard to differentiate our program from other programs. Because again, we had all worked, for other publishers. We did the same type of research, surveys, focus groups, and what have you. So we got to put together an innovation initiative, and I worked with a firm out of Israel called Systematic Inventive Thinking. And we trained over 1,000 people in our organization on the innovation methodology. And it was very cool to see the types of things that we were doing that really helped us think differently about the books that we were putting together, the technology that we were putting together.
That's so cool. I mean, that's what a neat thing. And it's funny that what you're talking about now, because now you do see new companies kind of popping up, and but there for a while, everything was like almost hyphenated, like a million different words crushed together.
Yeah.
It's like, so this week you're what?
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, that's true. That's a great point, Steve, because customers could not keep it straight. They rarely knew us by our company name. They knew us by the cover of the book.
Wow.
We use the green cover, or we use the red cover, and it's like, oh my God,
That's funny.
The only time that was great is when we were owned by Paramount. We were actually owned by Paramount Pictures for a while.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's wild too. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause it's funny what you're just saying, because I remember teachers a lot of times would say, well, are we using the blue book this fall, or are we using the red book this fall?
There you go. There you go.
So that's hilarious. Cause that was all, and I was always kind of like, which book are you talking about? Which one do you think is the red one, and which one do you think is blue one? Anyway.
Yeah.
That's cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the book you made. I mean, you wrote this book, and you were a co-author of the book Shifting: How School Leaders Can Create a Culture of Change. Why'd you say, I got to write this book, and who's its target audience?
So the audience, first and foremost, was school administrators and teachers, and the genesis of the book was really, from my experience in the classroom and working with administrators and teachers when I was in publishing, but it was also based on my experience working in the publishing industry itself. And what I noticed was people used to approach change. We used to call it the shiny penny syndrome, where somebody would read a book or somebody would go to a conference or they would read an article, and all of a sudden we're doing X. And it's like we're all running to this side of the boat and doing X. And then somebody else would have a wild idea, and now we're doing that, but we haven't even finished with X. And the big problem that I noticed, Steve, and this was true of the way our company operated too, is that we didn't have agreement on purpose. And you and I we did a whole episode together when we talked about purpose. And if you agree on purpose, you can eliminate a lot of these types of changes that really don't have legs. They frustrate people. And so a lot of the book was dedicated to helping people formulate purpose. A lot of the book was dedicated to helping leaders be leaders. And we had this framework in the book. It's called the ARC framework, ARC. And the first part of that is assess. And what you wanted to do is assess yourself as a leader and assess your staff's ability to make a significant change that's going to lead to fulfilling your purpose. Then there's readiness. What kind of training do we need to do to support either the leader or the staff? And then finally, what kind of mechanics go into making the change itself? It was a much more deliberate process than a lot of organizations are used to. And because change can be a kind of a sexy thing to people. Let's do this, let's do that, and especially leadership, they love to talk about the change, and then they back out of the room and they're into something else.
Right.
So this was a way, especially to focus on leaders and say, you got to make sure that you're of the right mindset to do this type of work before you can enlist your team in helping to define what it is that, the type of change that you want. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And I've read the book too, and it's an awesome book. And as someone who was a high school principal who was hired in different places to make change, I wish I'd had your book first. So, but powerful book, powerful. And by the way, there's for the audience there that's not a paid endorsement. Okay, that's no money has exchanged hands for that. But it's a very powerful book, easy to read, understand, and follow. And for those of you who are thinking about, this is the type of leadership that you have, or you're going to step into that role. I mean, it's if you're wanting some form of guide, Jeff, your book would be perfect for that.
Yeah, it's really about it's really focusing on enterprise change. Big changes that you want to make, right, that are going to keep you focused on your purpose. So it's a slower, more deliberate process than some institutions want to go through.
What's funny about that, having experienced that, I like to say that when the organization itself talks about wanting to make change, a lot of times they don't really know what that means, and they have this thought in their head. And what I discovered is that some people really want you to tiptoe through the tulips, to kind of quote Tiny Tim here.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas others really want you to be a bull in a china shop, and it's the ones who want you to tiptoe through the tulips. They're the ones who you got to worry about, because they don't really know what they're asking for or what it might look like, and I don't know that they've ever really thought about it. And it's just an interesting thing. So
one of the superintendents I interviewed on the podcast, Dr. Michael Hines, was hired he was hired as a superintendent to bring change to a district. And when he started to institute these changes, his board basically said to him, what are you doing? Nice. It was, we want change, but as soon as you start to make it, it's kind of like Lucy with the football.
Yes, very much so. Really, I'm going to hold it this time. Yeah, right. Charlie Brown, don't fall for it. You got that exactly right. Oh, that would be a terrible conversation to have as a superintendent. They ask you, what are you doing? Okay, I guess I didn't understand. Nice. Well, good stuff. Well, great book, and it's awesome that you guys were able to make sure that it got written, because it's something that's definitely needed. And all right, Jeff. So let's talk about your podcast. You have this really cool podcast. It's called Getting Unstuck, Cultivating Curiosity. Talk a little about what you mean by your podcast title, Getting Unstuck, Cultivating Curiosity. And somewhere in there, you got to make sure that, because a question that you like to ask is, what are you curious about? So you got to make sure that you share that with us as well.
Yeah. So the semi-short answer, Steve, is that Cultivating Curiosity is the third iteration of the podcast. Been at this a little over 5 years. It was focused on organizational and individual change. That was the first iteration. And then when the book came out, my then co-host and I shifted it to talk about change in education. And when she left, because she was her responsibility as an adjunct professor just became too much to work on the podcast, so she left, and I continued it. And I got to the point, Steve, where there are so many, and I mean this sincerely, there are so many good podcasts on education. You're being one of the top ones. It was like I wanted to take my show in a slightly different direction. It's still about education in the broadest sense, but it's not always going to be focused on the administrator's office or the school classroom, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
And what I wanted to do was really to help people, was to ask them to think differently about what they think they know, and maybe to look at some new stuff, and with an open mind is the way I put it. So the show is very eclectic. I've interviewed a woman who was wanting to discover the origins of the French stew called cassoulet, and she did, but she also discovered a lot about her family. It was a tremendous memoir, but that wasn't her original intent. But what listeners got out of it, they start thinking about their own family history, and how it influenced who they are today. I interviewed the principal investigator on the mission to Pluto. That was one of the, I have to say, that was just a riot to be able to talk to him, to sit down and be able to talk to Dr. Alan Stern, because that was such an interesting mission. But again, it's like, well, why are we spending all this money on a mission to Pluto? And when you look at it, it's insignificant what we spend on space compared to other things, and what we learn from space compared to other things. So again, it's just trying to give a fresh perspective on some things, but it's very eclectic. Don't listen to me because you want to listen about leadership, or you want this or that. It's going to be very different every week. Like I just did this 4-part series on my travels through Europe earlier in the summer, and it was all about what I saw from a historical perspective. And what I hope to do there is to have people think differently when they're in their travels, if they're fortunate enough to get to travel, to look differently at how they view things, and especially history, because we often take for granted, we walk casually through a memorial or something like that. And I really dove into the details in that series.
You really did, and it's so cool. That's because you have this. You can tell you have this passion for the different stuff that you're talking about, like visiting memorials and so forth, and talking about the history that went on, and it really comes out. And one of the things I really like is that you do have this is an eclectic podcast, in that you have neat different types of shows that. Like one of my favorites is the gentleman and I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he had some impact on the movie The River Runs Through It. That was
he's a very interesting guy. He was hired as the fly fishing choreographer on the movie A River Runs Through It. So we got to work with Robert Redford. He was just in his late 20s at the time. Obviously, he knew fly fishing, but John Deach is his name, and he did all the choreography. And when you see Brad Pitt, the Brad Pitt character, hook into the big trout towards the end of the movie, and he's got his cigarettes tucked into his hat and he's flowing down the river, that's actually John.
That's cool.
Yeah. So he did that scene a couple of times, but he was inventing a lot of this because Redford would say, well, what are we going to do now, John? And John, this, 28, 29-year-old has to say, well, here's what I think we should do. And that turned out to be an incredible scene when the Redford, or not the Redford character, but the Brad Pitt character gets swept into the river. He's got his rod up in the air, and he's still got the fish on. So yeah, that was pretty cool. He's also a writer, Steve, and he's written a beautiful book called Grace by Waters. It's a spiritual book. I won't say it's a religious book, although he does have prayers at the end of every chapter, but these are more what I would call spiritual. And it's of the genre of fly fishing books where it's really not about fly fishing. It's about what nature does, the healing power of nature, and the idea that when you're in that situation, how it can encourage you to reflect differently than you might otherwise.
Love it. And that's what's cool is you get into these different conversations with these different guests that have all kinds of neat sorts of backgrounds, and you never know. And so many of them make you think about some of the different aspects of our life, and it's really cool that you do that, because it is definitely not, you're not from each episode to each episode. Which is what I love. It doesn't have like the same topic that's disguised behind whatever the person is that they do. And
exactly. Yeah. And that's part of that is just me, Steve. I'm curious about, a lot of stuff. And that, to answer your earlier question, that's one of the last questions I ask guests is, what are you curious about? And I try to keep it to what's one thing you're curious about, because a typical response is, well, I'm curious about many things,
Which is so cool, because it comes out, and it's neat to hear your guests talk about that, because it's like, what does make them curious, and what makes a rocket scientist, or what makes a person who one of the other episodes that I really thought was cool was you had the people who own the inn.
Kevin and Sue. Yeah.
Yes, that was cool. It's what a neat. I've never been to that part of the country, and
yeah, you got to get up there. It's beautiful, and that inn is a special place. It was Norman Rockwell's home. You're walking into a museum,
nice, and
if you don't feel Norman Rockwell, you're not alive, because he lived in that house, and now it's a country inn, and there's a red covered bridge just outside the inn that crosses one of the top trout streams in America.
Wow.
It's you can't invent stuff like this,
No, that's so cool.
And they're a delightful couple.
I can imagine. And just listening to that discussion made me go, I think I got it. There's a famous line from a movie that goes something like this: I feel the need for speed. Well, I feel the need for going fishing up north in Norman Rockwell's house.
There you go.
I love it. Yeah. So good stuff. So now that's bringing me to something else. And one of the things that you do, your career, you are a coach, and you're the director of Quetico Leadership and Career Coaching. All right. So the first thing you got to do is explain the name.
Thank you, Steve. You're one of the only people who's ever asked me how the name came about. Cool. I thought it would be the thing that would get discussions going, and people just like, anyway, Quetico is a wilderness canoe park in southwestern Ontario. And when I was a teacher in Illinois, I used to go up there at the end of the school year with my teaching buddies and my brother. And we would do wilderness camping and canoeing for a week or so. And there's no motors. You know, you eat what you carry in or what you catch. And, you know, if a storm comes up, there's no Holiday Inn that you can, you know, run into for cover. You know, you're in your tent or whatever. It was a great experience. But the name, I chose Quetico because it was an area that allowed me to reflect quite a bit on who I was and what I wanted. Because there were many times in the afternoon, you know, you'd be fishing, but you know how it is, Steve. You get into a canoe, you just lay back, you know, if the water's calm and you're feeling the sun. So there was that reflective aspect, but there was also a place of great personal challenge, physical challenge, mental challenge, because you could get on a portage. There were a couple portages that were a mile long. And especially when we went up there in late spring, early summer, you're walking through mud up to your knees and you're surrounded by black flies and mosquitoes and everything like that. You can't stop because you need to get to the next lake, right? And when you get to the next lake, you're hoping that it's going to be calm water, but it wasn't always. You know, the wind could kick up, as it did with my brother and myself once, and what was usually a 15-minute paddle turned into a 45-minute paddle against the wind and 3-foot waves. So that's why I chose Quetico, because I wanted my coaching to combine both the challenge that people could be facing in their career and what they want, but also the opportunity to help them reflect.
That's so cool. And so you've kind of answered my next thoughts about it, because what made you do it? I mean, what made you pursue and set up Quetico coaching? I mean, because
great question. It was actually my experience as a coachee. I was, and I've admitted this in other places, I was a horrible manager when I first started out, because I thought managers had to have all the ideas. And that they had to, leading was, you have all the ideas and people do what, you know, you're telling them to do. And I used to play a version of bingo with people where I would have the answer, underline the, in my mind, but I would ask people questions, often rhetorical, to get them to think about, well, what's in Jeff's head? As opposed to me saying, well, guys, what do you think of this? No, I played games with people, and I was eventually assigned a coach, and it was the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because I learned a lot about why I was leading the way I was leading, why I was managing the way I was managing, and how it was not productive. And it really shifted my thinking about what a good leader should be doing.
That's cool. That's very cool. It's interesting when we reflect. Things make us do that, and the power of coaching can help you really figure into things that you wish you'd done differently, or that you could do, or hadn't even thought about. And
exactly,
I love that. All right, so let's go there for a minute. I mean, could you talk about why leaders should invest in coaching? I mean, because that takes time, and you got.
It's, Steve, you'll probably remember this commercial. This was from, I think, the 70s. The company was Fram, F-R-A-M, Fram Oil. And they used to sell quarts of oil, and Mobil had its oil, Castor had its oil for your car or whatever. And Fram's slogan was, pay me now or pay me later. And the idea being, you would pay a premium for Fram oil because it's going to save your engine. Well, it didn't do anything different than other engine oils, but it was putting that idea in people's heads that, if you don't use Fram oil, you're going to pay for a new engine down the road. And all that to say, coaching is like that with leaders. The team can't perform at its best the department can't perform at its best if the leader isn't secure in what he or she is trying to do on behalf of those he or she serves. So high performance always starts with the leader. And every leader, every manager has blind spots, and coaching can help uncover that. I use a lot of data when I do coaching. I have a great assessment that I give to leaders. It identifies where they fall on 16 validated predictive behaviors in the workplace, and it can really be eye-opening for people to see, if a certain skill, if you have to demonstrate, let's say, flexibility in your role, but you score very low on flexibility, you're not going to be the change agent that you need to be, right? So
Get that
so
right.
I found it very useful to use data. We do a lot of value identification, but the big thing we do is work on purpose. What is it that you're trying to achieve, that you want the department to achieve on behalf of those that you serve?
That's cool. I think a lot of times that's what causes or derails things is the fact that we haven't really thought about what it is, what our purpose is, what we're trying to accomplish, what it is, and so we're influenced too much by those shiny pennies or you were talking about earlier and stuff, which is crazy. So good stuff. All right. So, you set up the coaching practice, you do the coaching, and we talked about why they should invest in it. And so you talked a little bit about this too. I mean, if someone reached out to you right now and said, "Hey, Jeff, I'd really like to do some coaching with you," what's that look like? What's the session going to be?
Well, the first thing that I try to get at is, what do they want out of it? And invariably, people come to coaching, and I use the analogy that it's like an onion, that what they say they want to get out of coaching is that first layer of the onion, but it's not always what they really want to get out of coaching. Coaching can start about, business issues or whatever, but underlying those other issues is often something deep in their personality or how they were raised or, whatever. But I have no expectation that what they say they want to accomplish in coaching is what really happens. And we gradually, through discussions, question and answer, scenarios, whatever, we get at what is really holding them back from behaving the way they want to behave.
That is so cool. And it speaks loudly to, understanding why we really should have some conversations and participate in coaching. Because I think so often, a lot of times leaders think it's for everybody else, but not for me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? Every good coach has a coach. And nice. It's a big help. I have one. And because sometimes you need a sounding board other than, in my case, my wife. She's heard all these stories and, she's quick with solutions. I don't necessarily need solutions. What I need are really good probing questions, open-ended questions. So we have to get people beyond the fact that they don't think that they need it. It's not something that says that you're lacking. It's actually a positive, because it says, I want to see where I can improve my behaviors that will better support those I serve.
I love that. It's one of those things that I think a lot of times people who are in roles, they don't realize how important it would be for people that they supervise if they have somebody coach, make sure they get a coach, because there's so many types of aspects to it that make it difficult for a supervisor to be a coach, I guess is my point. Because you might not be taking their advice as in the back of your head, you're going, are they really looking at this as a weakness and they're going to
exactly
check the wrong box on my evaluation here or something? Yeah.
That's such a good point, Steve. That it's not that you can't do coaching as a supervisor, but I think you have to have a good track record for doing it. If you're waiting with somebody and then all of a sudden you're jumping in with these open-ended questions that can set somebody off, like, oh, what did I do?
Right.
So coaching has to be a part of the normal discussion between employee and supervisor.
That's a great point. Great point. Good stuff. Well, I wish you the best with Quetico. That is so cool. It's what a powerful mechanism that is for helping leaders see what they want to do and become and their purpose, and help them through situations or help them think about the future and so forth. Good stuff.
Exactly.
Love it. All right. So, one of the things that we're getting close to finishing up, Jeff, and one of the things I want to make sure we do is if someone wanted to follow up and connect with you and or learn more, where would you send them?
So they can go to queticocoaching.com, the website, but they can also, if they just want to reach out to jeff.ikler@gmail.com, that's fine.
Awesome. I will put that information in the show notes so it's easy for him to find and easy for him to do. So good stuff. So I got a few last questions that I just got to make sure I talk about this, because we haven't talked about fishing yet, and we got to talk about fishing because you obviously have this passion about fishing. I like to fish, but I'm not as, I think the fish in Florida and in Alaska are a little bit hungrier, or at least dumber, because they see my bait and they're able to catch them. In Georgia, I got fish, I've drowned a lot of worms and a lot of shrimp and things like that. And it's like, I don't know about that. But so let's talk about fishing. Now, what do you like most about it? And why is it something that you like to do?
Well, it does get back to that idea of putting yourself let me say that differently, not putting yourself in nature, but realizing that you are always a part of nature. And it's a different mentality. When you approach a stream, a lot of people will approach a stream with the idea of, I just want to catch a fish. And, I have to admit, I was there in the early days, with my fly rod, I walk up, want to catch that big trout. But now it's different for me. And it's when I walk up to that stream, I want to study the stream and think about, where are these fish going to be hiding out, because where will they be in the water so they don't have to expend a lot of energy? They're going to let food come down to them. And instead of casting wildly into the river, you're trying to cast where you think the fish are. And it becomes, to me, it becomes much more interesting it's to me, it's not just about catching big fish. I'm now more interested in the technical aspects of fly fishing, especially with my casting. And this is kind of a growth story if we have time for it, Steve. But
go right ahead.
I was fishing in Central PA on Spruce Creek this past July, and I had a guide with me, and we both saw the dark shape of a trout sitting next to a log and sitting next to a bank. So this is a very smart trout, because it's positioned itself where water is flowing slowly towards it, but it has the protection of the submerged log, but it's also got the protection of the bank. I had about a 2 square foot area where I could put a cast if I wanted to entice this trout to hit it. And I did. And that to me was like, I didn't land the fish. He broke off because he was huge. Nice. And that's not a fish story. He was huge. And we were using very small hooks, debarbed. You take that barb off the hook, right, so that it's very easy to remove it from the fish's lip. But I was really proud of that, where I just dropped that fly right in and boom, he took it. So that to me is much more interesting, is to be able to read the water, and also a lot of times not to miss the sound of birds, the wind going through trees, the sound of the water as it's wrapping around your ankles and, in your waders and things like that. So that's why I love it. It's very relaxing. And if it ever gets to the point, and sometimes it does, where I'm starting to focus more on catching fish, I'll go sit down on the bank.
There you go. That's cool. That's very cool. Because I'm there with you with you go fishing. And one of the things I love is the fact that I'm in this different world. I'm not worried about emails,
There you go.
phone calls, or any of that type of stuff. And instead, I'm trying to figure out how I can outsmart the character in the water who's trying to figure out how to steal my bait and run away. And
Yeah, exactly.
I love that feeling. And that's so cool what you're talking about, because that is a neat feeling. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. When you go out and you see, I had over the last couple of years, I've had a good shot where the whole family went fishing in Alaska and a couple of times. And that was such a neat experience. Well, one of the things that happens when you're in that world is that you see things, there's more animals there than lots of the other places where I am.
Exactly.
And you either see the bear or you see the evidence that the bear have been there, the carcasses of the salmon or the marks on the trees. And you might run into elk or moose and beaver. I had a pleasure of sitting in a boat one time and we're trying to hit that hole where the king salmon are, and the guide tied up to this little embankment. Well, it turned out the little embankment turned out to be a beaver dam. The beaver came out of the thing, swam out towards the boat and slapped its tail on the water and just bam, bam, bam. And my guide's like, we got to get out of here because it's annoyed that we're here. And then to be surrounded, in that part of the world, I grew up in the 70s. I was a little kid watching cartoons a lot of times on Saturday mornings. And one of the things I used to do was a PSA for saving the bald eagle, the American bald eagle, because it had so many die from the pesticides that had been used.
Right.
And I'll never forget that, because had a chance to be out there in Alaska, the number of bald eagles that you see everywhere was just, and babies too, was just amazing. And you notice that, I had a blast fishing, but I also, the world that you're in is like,
exactly.
Wow. And that's cool what you're describing there. I got to go fishing again.
Someday I'll get up there.
There you go. Got to do it. You've been in some really cool stuff. And I brought that up because I got a chance for the first time ever to fly fish when I was in Alaska. And they teach you if you don't know how, and I don't know, and I still not sure I know how, but because you specifically, when you get a chance to go fishing for sockeye salmon, you can only catch them by fly fishing. And if you snag them accidentally, like by the dorsal fin or something like that,
that happens.
Right. And you have to pull them in and then release them. You don't have to keep them because you snagged them like that. And it's the most frustrating thing. It take you 20 minutes just to get them on shore, just to let them go.
Yeah.
Because you snagged them the wrong way. So good stuff. All right. So if you could go anywhere to fish, where would that be and why?
Well, Alaska, I think would be the one place. I'm going to Montana in a couple of weeks, fishing the Missouri. And then my father-in-law and I are going back down to Argentina in early December. It's their summer. It's their spring. Nice. And so we'll be fishing down there. But I would like to get up to Alaska at some point.
Very cool. Well, I got to tell you, it's worth it, especially with your love of being in the environment as much as the act of fishing. It's definitely worth it. So kudos. All right. So last one for you. When you talk about fishing, is there that one time or that one event that you will always remember? Could you share it with us? Okay. That one fish story is what I'm asking. What's that one you got to share?
Well, that's a fish story that at the time I wasn't proud of, but it was a great learning experience. I hooked a very big rainbow trout on a stream that was no wider than 5 feet wide. And these big fish will hide out in those waters. And I hooked him and he took off downstream. And unfortunately, I didn't follow him. I was playing him where I had hooked him, and he was down. Well, that just magnifies the pressure on the line. And after about 15 minutes, you hear that sound you never want to hear, which is,
yes,
just the line snapping, and then it's just kind of waving in the breeze at you.
Like, oh.
And it just, I was at that stage in my life where I looked at it as imperfection, that I couldn't land that. And since completely changed how I think about fishing and what I could learn from that experience. And so that's that, I wrote a piece called Letting Go of the One That Got Away, where I tried to finally put that to rest. And the way I did that, my wife and I were in Italy, and we went to see The Last Supper. And the thing about The Last Supper that you have to understand is that he used a very imperfect method of painting. And the paint started to fleck off almost instantly. Wow. And after 500 years, there's about 25% of the painting that's still left. Conservationists have painted in the rest of it. So when you get up as close as you can to the painting, which is about maybe 10 or 15 feet, you can still see the flecks of paint there. But there's very little of the original painting there. And all that to say is, if he could use an imperfect method, why can't I be imperfect, right? If this master of painting can be imperfect, why do I have to be perfect? And that's really what helped me overcome that.
That is a powerful statement, because it's hard to get over some of that stuff, especially when you got like what you're describing, or you got it right there next to the boat, or you're kind of like, you're telling everybody, and you know what's going to happen, because everybody's going to go, yeah. It's going to get bigger every time you tell a story, and you're going to say, no, it was like this big, and it's right. Yeah. So that's cool, because that makes so much sense, because it is one of those things that you have to figure out, how can I get over?
Because it doesn't serve you not to.
Right. It's, unless you're out for the giant, whatever, it's that giant catfish that exists in that hole, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I love it. Jeff, thanks so much for sharing your world with us. Teaching, educational publishing, podcasting, shifting, focusing, coaching, and fishing. What an awesome world you have. And I appreciate you taking time to talk with me today.
Steve, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And I'm looking forward to the next time we sit on the park bench together and crank one out together.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.